For most of human history, there were no cities, no walls, no taxes, no kings. If a conflict broke out, people just moved away. If the winter turned brutal, they changed their path. If the food ran out, they followed it. Freedom was simple. It was the power to walk away. But around 12,000 years ago, something changed. People stopped moving, and once we stopped, we never found our way back. For most of history, humans lived in small bands, tiny bands of 20 souls, 50 at the very most. Everyone knew each other, every path was known, every face was familiar, every season anticipated. They feasted on game, fish, fruits, roots, and nuts.
These nuts?
Anything the land could provide. The diet was varied, the work was demanding, but life was mobile. Movement itself was power. If a leader became overbearing, the group could just leave. If a person tried to dominate, they could disappear. If one place turned dangerous, others awaited. There were no borders, no permanent property, no fixed system strong enough to trap people. Nothing survived long enough to become eternal. Or at least not yet. Around 11,700 years ago, the climate started to change. The last ice age came to an end. The world began to warm. In the Near East, valleys were blanketed with wheat. Where the ground had been cold and harsh, wild grasses now thrived. Gazelles roamed in massive herds, and seasonal water became more predictable. For a while, this created an opening. Not a revolution yet, but just a pause. Some groups began staying longer in the same places. At first, they were still hunters and gatherers. They had not yet become farmers, but they were no longer fully nomadic either. The first whispers of civilization. They built stone houses, they dug storage pits, they ground grain on heavy stones that were too large to carry. And that detail matters, because once a stone is too heavy to move, the life around it starts to change. You are no longer just passing through. Now you basically have to settle and structure your life around that big-ass rock. Around 10,800 before Christ, the climate turned again. This time it got colder. The rise in heat ceased. The world became more unstable. Wild food grew less predictable. Every season turned against them, and the old rhythm broke. But now they had something to rely upon. Storage, houses, buried grain, and children. Although they were more of a burden than a resource, there were too many children to just pack them up like burritos and go. And that created a problem no one had truly faced before. The dichotomy between leaving and claiming the occupied land. For the first time, an answer was not obvious. Leaving meant losing the stored food, abandoning the labor already spent, giving up the place you had already started to shape. The choice was made. They stayed. They began to shape the land. They selected the seeds that would survive. They uprooted any plant that competed for the soil. They redirected the water. They guarded the patches that gave the best return. Agriculture did not begin as a grand vision. It emerged from the demands of life. The land stopped feeling like a gift and started feeling like something you had to maintain. And once it required maintenance, everything changed. The bones hold the story of their lives. The skeletons of the first farmers show people who were shorter than earlier hunter-gatherers. They had more signs of stress, more wear in the spine, more damage in the joints. Their teeth often show decay from starchy diets, and their knees show damage from long hours of repetitive work. The body adapted to the system, but it paid the price. As ironical as it seems, civilization did not begin with comfort. It began with decline. People worked longer hours, ate a narrower diet, got sick more often. Their backs were fucked before they hit 30, and yet the system continued to grow. Agriculture created something hunter-gathering could not create at scale: surplus. For the first time, food could be stored in large amounts. Once food could be stored, it could be counted. Once it could be counted, it could be controlled. Once it could be controlled, it could be taxed. Once taxed, it could sustain people who produced nothing themselves. This is the moment where hierarchy begins. It didn't begin with philosophy. It began with grain. A cultivated field does not produce instantly. It usually takes months. A single raid can destroy everything, and one flood could erase a season's yield. Agriculture creates something that is both valuable and vulnerable, a dangerous combination. Where there is storage, there is theft. Where there is theft, there is defense. Where there is defense, there is organization. Where there is organization, there is authority. And authority, once it exists, it fucks you in the ass. Jericho built massive stone walls, not to look impressive, but to protect grain. In southern Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates were fierce and unpredictable. They flooded, they dried, they shifted course. A person could not simply plant and hope. Water had to be managed, canals had to be built, and work had to be coordinated across many households. No single family could handle that alone. Someone had to supervise labor, harness the waters, and impose order. At first, the authority may have looked practical. Then it became normal, then unquestionable. By 3800 before Christ, in southern Mesopotamia, Uruk had grown into one of the largest cities in the world. Tens of thousands of people lived within its walls, strangers packed together, sharing the same streets. For the first time, multitudes lived side by side without knowing one another, a new kind of life. It was in this city, Uruk, where the very first writings emerged, not to preserve poetry, not to tell myths, but to track, record, and tax the food and the work. They literally invented writing to count fucking cereals. See, modern archaeologists have found millions of identical clay bowls in Mesopotamian ruins. They are known as beveled rim bowls, and each bowl represented a portion. They were standard rations for people. Food was no longer simply gathered and eaten. It was distributed at scale. It was at this moment that the worker ceased to be independent, and that dependency was the engine of the new world. Cities were no longer mere places. They had become machines of survival built at scale. And of course, a machine requires rules. It needs records, enforcers, an elite, a priest class, a manager class, a military class, a class of people who collect, a class of people who organize, a class of people who protect the system and in doing so profit from it. This was the unseen price we paid for choosing to stay. When movement ends, structure begins. The first cities were not peaceful places. They were crowded. They were dirty. They were vulnerable to disease. They concentrated waste, parasites, and conflict. And it was in Mesopotamia that two cities called Uruk and Umma fought over irrigation canals. That detail is important. These were not wars fought over religion, people, or land. They were wars over water, a single motherfucking molecule called H2O. They fought over the very arteries that fed the new world. Uruk and Umma fought again and again. If one city controlled the canal, it controlled the harvest. If it controlled the harvest, it controlled the people. And whoever controlled the people controlled the future. The wars were brutal. Prisoners were taken, borders hardened, and armies marched. The workers dug the same canals that had just been used to feed the enemy. The conquered often helped maintain the machine that conquered them. That is how permanent power works. It turns labor into obedience and obedience into routine. The king appeared in this world as something more than a leader. He offered protection. In return, he demanded tribute, labor, and loyalty. And the deal kinda made sense, because the world had become dangerous in a new way. The city needed walls, the fields needed canals, and the grain needed guards. The system needed someone at the top. That top position became nearly impossible to remove because it was no longer about a single person. It was about the entire structure. If the ruler fell, another arose. That one could fall again, yet the system stood. The real creation was never the king. It was the state, a machine that outlives any individual of his time. This political system did not remain confined to Mesopotamia. It appeared in Egypt, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River, different climates, crops, and gods, different languages, and even styles of life. Conquests created a new problem. A king could take land. He could take tribute, even take prisoners above all. But how do you make people believe that his power is not temporary? A strong army is not enough. Rulers needed something deeper than force. They needed legitimacy. In Egypt, that legitimacy became divine. It came from God. The pharaoh was not just a man sitting on a throne. He was divine order made human. He was the bridge between the gods and the world below. He was the reason the Nile rose on time, the reason the land stayed fertile, the reason chaos did not return. This was not just propaganda. It was a way to solve a political problem. If the ruler is sacred, then disobeying him is not just rebellion. It is blasphemy. Now even your everyday tax fraud got fucked in the ass, because taxation was now spiritually enforced by no less than fucking God himself. And that changes everything. Suddenly, the state is no longer simply a machine of labor. It becomes a cosmic structure, a system that reaches into the sky and comes back down as law. The temples, the rituals, the festivals, and the offerings help turn power into something invisible, something that felt older than any individual, something that could outlive any one king. If people believe the ruler was chosen by the gods, then the throne is no longer a seat you fight for. That is why religion and kingship grew together. Once one city could dominate others, the next step was obvious. Why stop at just one city? Why collect tribute from one harvest when you can collect it from many? Why control one canal when you can control an entire river basin? Why rule one city when you can rule them all? That is where empires are born. Around 2334 before Christ, Sargon of Akkad did something new. He did not just defeat a rival city. He built a system that could absorb many cities under one command. This was the first empire in the deep sense, not just a powerful city, not just some local pussy-ass kingdom. It was a fucking political machine that stretched beyond a single place and bound many into one. And that required more than war. It required roads, messengers, garrisons, governors, standard measures, a chain of command. Sargon had to turn conquest into administration. That is the hidden truth of empire. A city-state can survive just by defending itself. An empire must constantly coordinate, and coordination is expensive. Every new territory adds more mouths to feed, more loyalty to enforce, more rebellions to fear, and more records to write. The empire looks unstoppable from the outside, but from the inside it is always under strain. Sargon understood this better than most, and so did his successors. They spread officials across conquered regions. They placed loyal power where resistance might grow. They made local rulers answer to a center that was far away and increasingly abstract. That abstraction matters, because once power is no longer personal, it becomes repeatable. The king is no longer just a king, sitting on his dusty throne, scratching his royal balls. He becomes the head of an apparatus also known as an empire. But an empire cannot run on fear and gods alone. Fear works fast, then it wears out. If every city must be crushed separately, the empire never sleeps. So rulers needed something more stable than punishment. They needed law. Law is one of the greatest inventions of civilization, because it turns power into something that looks neutral. Around 1750 before Christ in Babylon, Hammurabi made law famous. His code was carved into stone, public, visible, permanent. That was the point. The law was not hidden in the palace. It stood in the open as if it had always been there, as if it were discovered rather than invented. But universal law is not really about fairness. It is about scale. When a ruler governs a small village, he can judge each dispute personally. But the second that motherfucker starts ruling dozens of towns, he cannot sit there like a nosy abuela, personally judging every petty dispute. So law becomes a tool for making society predictable. If the same offense leads to the same punishment, then the center does not need to intervene every time. The system begins to regulate itself. That is how power deepens. Hammurabi's code also revealed something else. Not everyone was equal before the law. Under this law, a free man, a dependent worker, and a slave could be punished differently for the same act. So law did not erase hierarchy. It stabilized it even further. That is the real genius of legal systems. They make inequality feel organized. And once people begin to obey rules they did not write, civilization becomes harder to resist. By the time Rome rose, the logic was already ancient. Take land, build roads, march your horny armies, install governors, extract the tribute, and repeat. Rome did not invent empire. It perfected expansion. At first, it was just one city among many. Then it absorbed neighbors, then rivals, then entire regions, and then seas. What made Rome different was not only its military, it was its ability to turn conquest into infrastructure. A Roman road was not just a road, it was a supply line, a message route, a control mechanism, a way to make the center feel close. Even when the emperor was 2,000 miles away jerking off, the legions marched, but behind them came surveyors, tax collectors, administrators, engineers, and settlers. Rome became a machine that fed on movement. Its power relied on moving outward. When expansion slowed, the whole structure became harder to hold. Another hidden truth of every empire. It is never finished. It must keep growing or it starts to strain under its own weight. The Roman Empire became so large that its borders were no longer just edges. They were permanent wounds, places where the system had to stay armed just to remain itself. Something that would make the nomadic man who gave birth to civilization ashamed of himself. At some point, the machine began to fail. Not in one instant, not in a single cinematic fall. It failed like a slow, sneaky diarrhea, without anyone inside noticing the shitty smell at first. Collapse almost never looks like collapse from the inside. It looks like bureaucracy. It looks like inflation. It looks like empty roads, unpaid soldiers, broken trust, and governors pretending everything is still under control. Rome did fall, but it also lingered. The Western Empire did not simply vanish overnight. It weakened under the weight of its own size, its own contradictions, and its own hunger for expansion. The farther it stretched, the harder it became to hold together. The center became slower, dragging its balls through molasses. The edges became more independent. Power stopped feeling distant and started feeling absent. Loyalty moved downward. From empire to province, from province to city, from city to tribe. The machine was still there. It was just no longer obeying the hand that built it. And that may be the warning every civilization holds. We build systems so large that they begin to demand more than any person can offer. More labor, more taxes, more obedience, more faith in abstractions that cannot be seen or touched. A tribe survives because everyone knows everyone else. A bunch of assholes who smell each other's farts every day. But a machine with millions inside it is empty of that soul. It can only continue. It grows without life, organizes without mercy, and consumes without end. Until one day it no longer knows how to stop. Rome was not unique in this. It was only the clearest example. Every civilization reaches the same point eventually. Human beings were not shaped for this scale. We were not meant for lives dictated by endless rules, restricted by borders, controlled by economies beyond our understanding, and governed by institutions too vast to be fully known. That was the real hidden cost, not just taxes, wars, or falling walls, but sheer disconnection from the life we were meant to live. We called it progress, but perhaps our greatest error was thinking we could survive in structures far too vast for human scale. When the empire falls, when streets grow silent, when the collectors vanish, when the honors fade, the state is gone, but the people endure. The strength of the small tribe, the wisdom of the campfire, and the power of a people who did not wait for a ruler to fall, but simply packed their kids like burritos and moved. Empires may vanish, but the endless walker remains immortal.